December 10th, 2005. Somewhere after 2 in the morning. A quiet street in the Pelham Bay section of the Bronx. Two men are forcing their way into a basement apartment. They're not professionals. They're not organized. They're desperate and dope-sick and looking for pills. One of them is carrying a handgun. The man living next door hears the noise. He comes outside. He's 28 years old. He just got home from his midnight shift. His name is Daniel Nshautegui, and he is a police officer who has spent 3 years protecting this neighborhood. Armento fires. One shot, center mass, and Nshautegui goes down. The whole thing is over in seconds. And one of the two men standing in that driveway, bleeding into a silver Dodge Durango on Westchester Avenue when the first patrol cars arrive, is one of the most recognizable faces in American film. His name is Lilo Brancato, and 12 years before that night, Robert De Niro put him in a movie about a kid who had to choose between crime and a straight life. The kid in the movie chose right. Lilo chose wrong. And here's what gets me about this story every single time I come back to it. He didn't stumble into this. He wasn't grabbed off a street corner and forced into something. He had the career, the talent, the warning, the blueprint. He had all of it. And he still ended up bleeding on a Bronx sidewalk next to a dead cop. You can't make this up. This is not a mob story in the traditional sense. There's no Don, no underboss, no conspiracy. This is something worse. This is the story of a genuinely gifted kid from Yonkers who got everything he ever dreamed of, and then watched drugs take it apart piece by piece, until there was nothing left but one terrible night that cost a good man his life. But here's what makes this story genuinely insane. Before Lilo Brancato became the face of one of the most devastating cautionary tales in Hollywood history, he was a Colombian-born baby adopted at 4 months old by a working-class Italian family in Yonkers, New York. His father, Lilo Sr., was a Sicilian construction worker. His mother, Domenica, was from Calabria. They gave him everything they had. They gave him a name that sounded like it came straight out of the old neighborhood. And they raised him in a world where Italian-American identity was thick in the air, where the Bronx was right across the city line, and where every kid at Roosevelt High School knew exactly what the streets could offer. This is the story of how a talent scout at Jones Beach changed the direction of one young man's life and set in motion a collision that nobody could have predicted. How a movie about choosing the right path got made by the one person who would eventually ignore everything it was saying. How addiction doesn't ask about your credits or your connections, it just takes. And how the person who paid the ultimate price for all of this had nothing to do with any of it. But here's the question this story keeps raising. At what point does a man stop being the victim of his own addiction and become something more? Because that line, wherever it is, Lilo Brancato crossed it. And the answer to that question changes everything about how you see what happened. Here's the thing about Yonkers in the 1980s. It is not the Bronx. It is not a war zone. It's a working-class city sitting right on the northern edge of New York City, close enough to smell the money of Manhattan, far enough away to feel like it'll never arrive. Lilo grew up in a neighborhood where his father built things with his hands and his mother ran an electrolysis business. There was food on the table. There was love in the house. By every measure, the kid had a shot. What he also had, from the time he was old enough to watch movies, was an obsession with Robert De Niro. Not just any obsession. He did the impressions. He had the mannerisms. People who knew him growing up said the kid could walk into a room and make you feel like you were looking at a young De Niro. Not an imitation, an echo, something deeper than that. Think about that for a second. This is 1992. Lilo is 16 years old, spending a day at Jones Beach on Long Island, doing whatever 16-year-olds do. And a casting scout working on Robert De Niro's directorial debut notices him in the crowd, not at an audition, not in an acting class, at the beach. Because the kid looks exactly like the man they're trying to cast a younger version of. That is the kind of thing that only happens in the movies, except it happened in real life. The role was Calogero. The film was A Bronx Tale. And if you know anything about that film, you already understand why this story is so hard to sit with. Calogero is a kid from the Bronx, growing up in the 1960s, caught between two worlds. His father, Lorenzo, played by De Niro himself, is a hard-working bus driver who tells his son that the honest life is the only life worth living. On the other side is Sonny, the neighborhood mob boss, who offers money and protection and belonging and everything that looks like power when you're young. The whole film is one long argument about which world Calogero is going to choose. In the movie, Calogero eventually chooses his father's path. He chooses the straight life. He survives. Now here's what gets me about this. Lilo Brancato walked onto that set at 16 and started using drugs the same year. Marijuana first, alcohol. The way it always starts, slow and unremarkable. He was filming the story of a kid choosing between crime and a good life, and off camera, the pull toward self-destruction had already quietly begun. You look back at the timeline and it's almost unbearable in its precision. The film was released in October of 1993. The career launched, and the clock on everything that was going to go wrong had already started. Stay with me here, because this is the part of the story that usually gets skipped. Lilo didn't crash immediately. The opposite happened. After A Bronx Tale, the offers came. He went straight from De Niro's Bronx to Penny Marshall's Renaissance Man in 1994, then Crimson Tide in 1995, sharing the screen with Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman. He was 20 years old, and he had a legitimate Hollywood career in front of him. Agents, studio meetings, his face on movie posters. And none of it was enough to compete with what the drugs were doing to his brain. By his mid-20s, the recreational had become compulsive. Marijuana and alcohol had given way to cocaine. Cocaine had given way to heroin. The career started slowing down. The calls stopped coming as reliably. And then, in a moment of either perfect irony or perfect cruelty, depending on how you look at it, he landed the role of Matthew Bevilacqua on The Sopranos. Think about who Matthew Bevilacqua is. He's a young, desperate, low-level associate trying to prove himself to Tony Soprano. He wants in, badly. He makes reckless decisions trying to earn respect. He ends up getting executed in a field in New Jersey.
How was that?
It's good.
He's a cautionary tale in a show that is essentially one long cautionary tale about the mob. And Lilo Brancato played this character while, by his own admission, showing up high on set. He later told interviewers straight up he was using during production. The character's desperation was, in the most disturbing way, completely authentic. Here's what I keep coming back to with this. He played two characters who were destroyed by choosing the wrong life. Once in a movie, when he was 16. Once on television, in his mid-20s. Both times the story was exactly the same. And both times in real life, he was in the process of making the exact choice those characters were warned against. That's not irony. That's something else. That's a man watching his own life play out in front of him and being unable to stop it. The connection to Stephen Armento came through Armento's daughter. She and Lilo were involved. That's how the relationship started. Not through any organized crime connection. Not through a neighborhood introduction. Through a personal relationship that led Lilo deeper into a world where a 50-year-old man with a 26-year criminal history was spending time with a television actor who needed drugs and had money. Here's what you have to understand about Armento. He wasn't connected in the traditional sense anymore. He had been a low-level associate of the Genovese crime family. Had been. The family had pushed him out because of his own drug addiction. Even the mob didn't want him. He was banished for the same thing that was eating Lilo alive. And somehow, these two men found each other in Yonkers. A discarded mob associate with a gun and no future, and a fading actor with a serious heroin habit and a name that still meant something to the outside world. By the time 2005 arrived, Lilo was in freefall. He later said that toward the end of his addiction, he spent $14,000 in 2 weeks on drugs. 2 weeks, $14,000. On June 10th of that year, he was arrested for heroin possession, 4 glassine bags. The arrest didn't stop anything. 2 days before December 10th, he was arrested again in Yonkers. A revolving door that was moving faster and faster. Now here's where it gets genuinely insane. They didn't plan an elaborate robbery. There was no crew, no surveillance, no preparation. What happened on December 10th was the logic of addiction, not of crime. Lillo and Armento had been out at a strip club in the Bronx. They were using. They needed more. Lillo knew his drug supplier, a man named Kenny Scavatti, had prescription drugs in his basement apartment in the Pelham Bay section of the Bronx. The plan, if you can call it that, was simple. Go to the apartment, break in, take the pills. That was it. That was the whole plan. Step 1 was the desperation. They were dope sick and past the point of rational thinking. Step 2 was the location. Scavatti's basement apartment in Pelham Bay, a place Lillo knew, a place he had been before. Step 3 was the equipment. Armento had a .357 caliber handgun. Brancato later said he had no idea Armento was carrying it. Step 4 was the entry. After 2 in the morning, they force their way into the apartment. There is nothing sophisticated about any of this. 2 addicts breaking a door. But here's what they didn't know. And here's what makes this whole night something other than a routine burglary gone wrong. The man living next door to Kenny Scavatti's apartment was Daniel Anshategui, 28 years old, 3 years on the force with the New York City Police Department, assigned to the 40th Precinct in the Mott Haven section of the Bronx. He had just finished his 4 in the afternoon to midnight shift and come home. Daniel Anshategui was, by every account from people who knew him, exactly the kind of person you want living next door. Neighbors in the West Farms section of the Bronx, where his parents, Maria and Pedro, still lived, described him as a man who would give his right hand for anyone who needed it. He visited his parents almost every single day. When his father's health started declining, Daniel drove him to medical appointments. He had been on the force for 3 years. He was 28 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He hears the noise. He comes outside. He sees 2 men. Armento fires. 1 shot, hitting Daniel Anshategui in the chest. He goes down. Brancato is also hit in the exchange. Both Brancato and Armento are wounded. And then it's over. A man who spent his shift protecting the Bronx is dying on the ground 30 feet from his own front door. When the first patrol cars arrive, they find Lillo Brancato slumped against a silver Dodge Durango on Westchester Avenue. He is bleeding. The car is right there. He didn't even get away. Here's what I think about when I think about that moment. He played a kid named Calogero who learned that the street eventually takes everything. He played Matthew Bevilacqua, who died because he made stupid, desperate moves, trying to get what he wanted. And there he is, bleeding in a Bronx driveway at 2 in the morning because he broke into an apartment to steal pills. The movies were telling him his entire career. He could not hear them. Both men were taken to Jacobi Medical Center. Brancato was charged with second-degree murder under the felony murder rule. Under New York law, if someone dies during the commission of a felony you're involved in, you can be charged with murder even if you didn't pull the trigger. Armento was charged with first-degree murder. Daniel Anshategui was posthumously promoted to detective first grade by the New York City Police Department. He was 28 years old when he died. The promotion was the only thing left to give him. Brancato spent the next 3 years in Rikers Island, waiting for trial. 3 years. And here is the detail that is almost too dark to sit with. During those 3 years at Rikers, he continued using. He overdosed inside the jail. 4 bags of heroin and 20 pills. He flatlined. Someone brought him back. And it took that moment, that rock-bottom moment in a prison medical room, for the decision to finally become real. His trial began on November 17th, 2008. Armento had already been convicted of first-degree murder on October 30th in a separate proceeding and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Brancato's trial, the central question was whether he knew Armento was armed, whether he intended for anyone to die, whether his presence in that driveway made him legally responsible for what Armento's gun did. On December 22, 2008, the jury came back not guilty on the murder charge. The Enchautegui family was, by all accounts, devastated. Then Mayor Michael Bloomberg publicly slammed the verdict. The community that Daniel had served was in mourning, not just for his death, but for the acquittal of the man who had been standing 10 feet away when it happened. There is no version of this outcome that feels like justice to the people who loved Daniel Enchautegui. And that matters. That deserves to be said clearly. On January 9, 2009, a judge sentenced Brancato to 10 years in prison for first-degree attempted burglary. He had already served 3 years pre-trial. He was released on parole on December 31, 2013, 8 years total behind bars. Stephen Armento never came home. He died inside a federal correctional facility on January 2, 2024, at the age of 66. He spent the last 19 years of his life in a cage. He died there. Here's what Daniel Enchautegui's family lives with. Not a verdict, not a sentence, the absence. His sister Yolanda Rosa Nazario was in the courtroom when Brancato was acquitted of murder. His parents, Maria and Pedro, who used to watch their son drive up almost every day just to check in, just because that's who he was, they spent years watching a legal process try to assign a value to their son's life. In 2012, the 40th Precinct in Mott Haven dedicated a plaque in Daniel's name on the wall. That plaque is the permanent record of a 28-year-old man who came out of his house to do the right thing and got killed for it. Here's what I keep coming back to with this story. Not the legal outcome, not the sentences, the specific, brutal irony of the movie. A Bronx Tale is not a film about crime. It's a film about the possibility of escape. It's about a kid who has every reason to go wrong and finds a way to go right. Calogero survives because he listens to his father's voice, because he chooses the harder road, because somewhere inside him the part that wants a real life is louder than the part that wants the fast money and the easy belonging. Lilo Brancato played that kid. He was that kid, on screen and off screen. From the moment the cameras started rolling, he was making the opposite choice, not because he was evil, not because he didn't know better, because addiction is not a moral failing, it's a disease, and this particular disease got hold of him at 16 and didn't let go until it had taken almost everything. But here's the thing. That explanation, as true as it is, can only go so far, because at the end of the night on December 10, 2005, Daniel Enchautegui did not have the luxury of a diseased defense. He came out of his house to stop a crime and he was killed. His parents don't get to say the disease took their son. They just don't have a son anymore. And that's not just Lilo Brancato's story. That's what addiction does when it reaches critical mass. It doesn't stay contained. It radiates outward. It destroys the person at the center, and then it destroys whoever is close enough to the blast. Daniel Enchautegui was not close to anything. He was in his own home. He just had the bad fortune to live next door. And that's the part of this story that no sentence, no acquittal, no rehabilitation center, no documentary can fully resolve. Lilo Brancato was released on December 31, 2013, with a 10 p.m. curfew, mandatory drug testing, no alcohol, and a requirement to find employment. He has been sober since. He works at addiction treatment centers now. He holds weekly sessions. He talks to young people about what the bottom looks like. In 2016, he returned to acting with a film called Back in the Day. And in 2025, 32 years after A Bronx Tale was released, he shared the screen again with Terrell Hicks, his co-star from that film, in a movie called Common Ground. Think about how that lands. The kid who played Calogero, the warning he was given on screen, the life he actually lived. And then, on the other side of all of it, standing in front of a camera again. Still here, still working, still trying, There's a moment in A Bronx Tale where Sonny, the mob boss, looks at Calogero and tells him the saddest thing in the world is wasted talent. He means it as a compliment, a reason to aspire to more. But the line has a different weight when you know what the actor playing Calogero was about to go through. Daniel Nchautegui was promoted to detective first grade the day he died. His parents still live in the West Farm section of the Bronx. The 40th precinct still has his name on the wall. And somewhere tonight, in a rehabilitation center in New Jersey, there is a man with a name from an Italian neighborhood and a face like a young De Niro, telling someone younger than himself that the movie was right, that the choice is real, that the cost is real, that he knows because he paid some of it and someone else paid the rest. If this story hit you the way it hit me, do me a favor and subscribe. We drop a new deep dive every single week, and every one of them is told the same way, with the truth in it. Drop your take in the comments. Here's what I want to know. Can you fully separate the tragedy of addiction from the responsibility for the consequences it causes? Because in this story, those two things are the same event, and I'd like to know where you land on that.